The purpose of this video is to talk about traits that we refer to as non-Mendelian. What this means is that the traits no longer have a clear dominant and recessive characteristic. One of the things you have to understand about Gregor Mendel is that he got very, very lucky. Many of the traits in nature that we see don't have clear dominance and recessiveness. And it just turns out that all of the traits that he happened to study in pea plants follow the strict rules of what we now call Mendelian genetics. So things that have one dominant and one recessive trait. Unfortunately, as I said before, not everything behaves this way. There are a bunch of exceptions. We'll just talk about two for now. The first one is the concept of what's called codominance. If something is codominant, you end up with both of the parents' phenotypes, like what they looked like, in the offspring. A way that I remember this is focusing on the prefix co. Ooh, we got the lightsaber back again. Focusing on the prefix co. The idea with co is that you have two things sharing some kind of role or responsibility. Think about on a sports team. If you have co-captains, there are two people that are in charge. So we have the idea that co equals both. So you've got two. So you'll be seeing, again, the traits of both parents in the offspring. For example, let's say we took a red flower and a white flower and bred them together. If they were codominant, instead of red or white being dominant to one another, you would actually end up with both red and white in the flowers of the plants. Another easy way to remember this one, I sometimes think of it as cow dominant, because you end up with cows being a great example of this one as well. You can imagine this cow having, one parent that's a black cow, the other parent that's a white cow, so you ended up with a spotted cow as an example of codominance. So in this case, we're actually seeing the phenotypes from both parents. So I'll write these things down for you. One is to think of it as cow dominant, just to kind of give you an example. Get this guy out of the way. I can make it real tiny now since I don't worry about grabbing it. And then the other one is that we're seeing both phenotypes. So we're seeing what both parents look like in the offspring. The other one that we'll talk about is referred to as incomplete dominance. So here's an example of that one. If we look at these flowers, we have, if I can grab it, there we go. We got a red flower, lightsaber, and a white flower being bred together, and we end up with pink flowers as the offspring. So in this case, you end up with a third phenotype. I sometimes think of this as like mixing them. Think about like if you were in art class. If you took red paint and you mix it with white paint, you'd end up with sort of like a pale red or a pinkish color left over. So in this particular example, if I can grab our picture and get it out of there, for incomplete dominance, we'll write down a couple of things for this one. One way that I think about it, as I mentioned to you before, is the idea of mixing. Sort of mixing the colors together. Another thing that's good is if you think of it as having a third option, or we would consider a new phenotype. So remember, phenotype is what they physically look like. If we end up with a new phenotype, it's like looking up here, we end up going from, our white and our red to now having pink, to having a third option or a third color. The key to this, though, is that we no longer use capital and lowercase letters. We'll look at how this applies to like the Punnett square problems in a minute. But no matter which one it is, whether it's codominant or incomplete dominant, then you know that there's no longer going to be a dominant trait and a recessive trait. It's now sort of like a mixing of the two. So I think that the prefix co helps with codominant. If you think of that as both, again, the idea is of cows, or you got both phenotypes. In incomplete dominance, it's just a mixing. You get a third option now, a third color, if we're dealing with colors, and then a new phenotype for the offspring. I will take a look at an example problem for this one, just to give you an idea of how to complete one of these things. So if we're looking at this problem, this one is an example of incomplete dominance. One thing about this new topic is that I will have to come right out and tell you if it's a Mendelian exception, most of the time. There are a few setups where I don't have to tell you, but in the beginning, it'll usually lay it out for you in the problem. So this one says we've got two incompletely dominant plants. They're crossed. The first one is white, the second one is red. Show this cross in the following Punnett square. If you notice, I'm now asking you for a little bit less information because there's no longer a dominant and recessive trait to write down. But I still want offspring genotype, offspring phenotypes, and then this is also new, the percent chance of getting each phenotype. We'll talk about this at the end of the problem. But the first thing we have to do is write down the parents. Now, since I don't ask you to do this up top, I'm technically not going to be grading for this, but I still think it's the best way to set these problems up. So if we write down our parents first, it says the first parent is white and the second one is red. So in this case, since there's no longer a dominant trait, we're now going back to just using two letters, which is I think what a lot of people wanted to kind of do in the beginning. The white parent will be capital W, capital W. The one that's red will be capital R, capital R. So we put those in our Punnett square, one on the top and one on the side. What we get then when we mix them together is the same thing in each box. And now I just happen to choose to write R first. It doesn't really matter which one you pick. I would stick with keeping them alphabetical, but technically it's not a big difference. What you have to know, though, is what each of these phenotypes would be. WW would be a white plant. RR is red. But now we've got RW. Here's where we have to go back to the problem. It says up here that it's incompletely dominant. If you remember from what we talked about before, incompletely dominant is where you think of them as like mixing. You get a third color, you get a new phenotype for this one. So now RW is going to be pink for us. If this problem was an example of codominance, this one would be red and white spotted. But in this case, since it's incompletely dominant, you do end up with a new genotype of pink. Or a new phenotype, rather, of pink. Now, if we look for our offspring genotype, back up here to the problem, that's what it tells us in the Punnett square. RW in each box. So that's all we need to write on this side. RW. Offspring phenotypes, they're all the same. They are all pink. And the percent chance of getting each phenotype is 100% because it's in every single box. What I want you to think about for the percentages is that each box really represents a 25% probability. So it makes it easy then to figure out what the odds are of getting different traits. Now, just like last time when we started with the regular Mendelian problems, this one's a pretty easy example. As we go through, some of the Mendelian exceptions will get a little bit more challenging. But just keep in mind, you've got to follow the same steps I talked to you about before. You're always figuring out the parent genotypes. You put the two parents in the Punnett square. Once you complete the Punnett square, you do offspring genotype, offspring phenotype, and now the final part, our new part here, is going to be calculating that percentage of getting each phenotype at the end. So it really isn't all that different, but you do definitely have to take the time to just memorize incomplete dominance and codominance. I think the example of the cow will hopefully help you. Remember, codominance is the one where you see both phenotypes where it's spotted, and then incomplete dominance, if you think of it as like mixing paints together, that's where you get a new color, like a third phenotype as our example. As always, I appreciate you watching, and take the time to answer the questions after this video is over. Thank you.